This is a video discussion on landscape dynamics. The following are the topics to be discussed. This video is divided into 4 parts.
Chapter 19.6 The Theory of Island Biography Applies to Landscape Patches.
The theory of island biogeography explains the concept of species richness, or the number of species on a particular island. For this concept, an island is any ecosystem that is drastically different from its surrounding ecosystems. For example, an oasis in a desert is an island. An alpine zone is an island. Even a pond is an island. MacArthur and Wilson first published the theory based on a study about Pacific birds. They found that large islands such as Sumatra, Borneo, and Papua had about 700 different species of birds present, whereas tiny islands like Christmas Island only had about 10. MacArthur and Wilson labeled Papua as the mainland of their study, and they found that islands closer to Papua had greater species richness than islands further away. There are several factors that influence species richness. The first is immigration, which is represented by the number of species that migrate to an island. The second is extinction. These species don't necessarily die out, but may be forced off the island due to competition. These rates can be modeled on a graph to determine the species richness of the island. The intersection of the number of species incoming and the number of species leaving the island is called the equilibrium. The equilibrium quantity indicates the species richness of the island. Geographic features such as island size and island location affect immigration and extinction rates, and thus the species richness of islands. Let's start with small islands. Small islands have low immigration rates because the small area of the island means that migrating species are less likely to arrive on the island. The small immigration rate also means that small islands have high extinction rates because species that have been driven off the island will be less likely to remigrate. Conversely, large islands have high immigration rates because the greater area makes it more likely that migrating species will arrive there and take up residence. The extinction rates of large islands are low, since species that are driven off the island are more likely to remigrate. This means that large islands have higher species richness than small islands. The second variable affecting species richness is the relative distance from similar ecosystems. Islands close to the mainland have high immigration rates because the shorter distance makes it more likely that species will be able to migrate to that island. As with large islands, the high immigration rate means a low extinction rate. Islands which are far from the mainland have low immigration rates because the greater distance makes it less likely that immigrating species will reach the island. Due to the low immigration rate, remote islands also have high extinction rates. Island biogeography is important in conservation biology, since nature reserves and national parks can be classified as islands. Through the application of the theory of island biogeography, we can approximate the number of species saved by a particular reserve, the extinction rate for a single species, and the optimal geometric structure of a reserve. It aids in the development of wildlife corridors, which allows for the movement of animals between habitats and thus increases the number of species supported by an area.
Metapopulation theory is a central concept in the study of landscape dynamics. Metapopulation theory examines the colonization and local extinction of local populations of a given species on the array of patches embedded on the broader landscape. For a given species, the landscape is assumed as patches of potential habitat varying in size, quality, and degree of isolation from one another. Each has the potential to support a distinct, partially isolated subpopulation. Metapopulation dynamics is governed by two sets of processes operating at two distinct spatial scales. At the scale of the individual patch, individuals move and interact with one another in the course of their routine activities. Population growth and regulation at the local scale are governed by the demographic processes of birth and death. At the metapopulation scale, the dynamics are governed by the interaction of local populations, namely the process of dispersal and colonization. In theory, all local populations have a probability of extinction, so the long-term persistence of the metapopulation depends on the process of recolonization. Colonization involves the movement of individuals from occupied patches to unoccupied patches to form new local populations. If no individuals move between habitat patches, the local populations act independently. If the movement of individuals between local populations is sufficiently high, then the local populations function as a single large population. The meta-population concept is therefore closely linked with the processes of population turnover. In 1970, Richard Levins of Harvard University proposed a simple model of metapopulation dynamics, in which metapopulation size is defined by the fraction of discrete habitat patches on the landscape occupied at any given time. The change in the fraction of habitat patches occupied by local populations through time can therefore be defined as the difference between the rates of colonization and extinction.
This is the end of part 3. Part 4 will be linked in the description box.